everyone, this video is going to review the history of Latin America all the way from the beginning of the course to the end. Now, my guess is that you've been studying world history all year long, and perhaps the AP test is right around the corner. If you're anything like my students, you've whipped around the world in different units that you went through chronologically, never really staying in one spot for long, and are kind of left scrambling to connect all the dots. But if you're feeling all mixed up, I'm here to help you piece together the story of Latin America in this one single video. Now, if you take a look at this fancy College Board map, you'll notice that Latin America is labeled, and it includes Mexico, Central America, South America, and as it says over here, the Caribbean. When we start our course in the year 1200 to 1450, there are two empires in the Americas that you must know, the Aztec and the Inca. Until this point, there was no connection between the American civilizations and Afro-Eurasia. No tech existed to cross the ocean, so there was no trading of goods or religions or diseases or languages. Now, the Aztecs were located in modern-day Mexico, centered around the city of Tenochtitlan, near the modern-day city of Mexico City. They conquered much of Mesoamerica, or Middle America, Mexico, and created tribute states very similar to the Chinese dynasties did. They divided up their empire into different provinces, where they then moved different warriors and their families to assert their dominance over these conquered lands. They also used human sacrifice to legitimize their rule, and utilized different agricultural innovations like chinampas to adapt to their local geography. Remember, more food, more people, and a more stable society. Plus, they were able to trade goods throughout their empire that they had developed, as well as using that tribute system to trade goods. Now, the Inca were located in modern-day Peru, and that really stretched into Ecuador and Chile as well in South America. They created a large land-based empire by conquering their neighbors and creating tribute states. They used a labor system known as the mita, which was like this mandatory public service of the Incan people. Think kind of like a required community service. The government used this labor system then to build this elaborate road system throughout the Andes Mountains and created a more unified state. They also legitimized their rule through religion, which was the worship of a sun god known as Inti, along with a pantheon of other gods. They too capitalized on their local geography to develop the vertical economy, based upon goods at different kind of altitudes in the Andes, along with this advanced terrace system to grow a variety of crops like potatoes and maize. Now, things will drastically shift as we go into the next historical period of our course, the years 1450 to 1750, the era of large land-based empires and these new European maritime empires. Now, obviously, the turning point was the rise of the European exploration and the discovery of the Americas, which was unknown to them. Plus, there is a lot of the College Board's learning objectives that are tied to this time period, so buckle up. There is a lot of information in this period that you need to know. Spain had recently been unified under Ferdinand and Isabel, and they sponsored Columbus as he tried to find another way to the Indian Ocean spice network. Due to the explosion of new technologies like the caravel ship and the flout, and these technologies that they built on like the compass and the astrolabe, Europeans were successful as they used these new technologies that enabled them to find new lands. More explorers and conquerors, known as conquistadors, followed to this new world. To them. Now, most famously, we learned about Hernan Cortez, who sailed towards Mexico and conquered the Aztecs in 1521, and then Francisco Pizarro, who conquered the Incas in 1533. This starts the overarching maritime empire we know today as the Spanish Empire. But why were such a small number of Europeans able to bring the downfall of these large empires like the Aztec and the Inca? Using Jared Diamond's famous argument, they were able to do this because of guns, germs, and steel. Due to the domestication of animals and agriculture thousands of years prior, agriculturalists from the Old World allowed for specialization of labor. They were able to develop new technologies like metallurgy and gunpowder, which came from China. Europeans were able to access and build on these technologies in a more recent time period, so they had stronger weapons and swords made from steel and guns and gunpowder, and were immune to all the diseases because they were around these farm animals for generations upon generations. Meanwhile, the people in the Americas did not have these technologies, which allowed a small number of Europeans to devastate these existing land-based empires like the Inca and the Aztecs. And this is how they established their maritime empire. guns, germs, and steel. How were they able to maintain that rule, especially across an ocean? Spain will utilize the viceroyalty system, which was a political bureaucratic institution created by the Spanish monarchy in the 15th century for ruling its overseas territories. The most famous being the Viceroyalty of New Spain in Mexico, established by Cortés, and the Viceroyalty that was established then by Pizarro in Peru. Now, each viceroyalty was governed by a viceroy or a governor who would then report back to the crown. Viceroys aided in the conversion of the native population to Christianity, most specifically Roman Catholicism, and oversaw an economy based entirely mostly on mining and ranching. Audiencias were just another part of the bureaucratic system that oversaw the administration of justice, where there was a judge or a lawyer who could voice the concerns of the people back to the crown. You'll notice that large governments yet again maintain control through a bureaucratic system. Now, unfortunately, if we trace roots back to why Spain established the viceroyalty in the first place, it probably goes back to the ideas of God, gold, and glory. New developed colonial economies in the Americas largely were dependent on agriculture. They used the existing labor systems like the Incan Mita, and they introduced new labor systems, including chattel slavery, including indentured servitude, the encomienda, and the hacienda systems. Now, Spain was interested in building the wealth of the crown, and they did this through coerced or forced labor. Now, the first system that you need to know was known as the encomienda. Now, a Spanish encomendero or landowner was granted a number of native laborers who would pay tribute to him in exchange for food and shelter. Much like we saw in Europe where serfs worked in the kind of lord's manorial system. But in the Americas, this coercive system was wildly brutal. The hacienda system arose when landowners developed agriculture on their lands with crops like wheat or sugar, and they forced these natives to work in their fields. Most conquistadors were men and had children with the native women. As the years passed, many missionaries like Bartolomé de las Casas wrote about how brutal these systems were, and some changes were developed, like the repartimento system, which shifted to more of a tribute labor system where natives retained their freedom and autonomy, minus the part where they still were required to work. Now, while many conquistadors were driven by their hot pursuit of gold, what they really found in the Americas was silver, specifically in Mexico and in Peru. At this time, European powers were driven by mercantilism, an economic system that drove nations to obtain wealth in their national treasury through high tariffs and obtaining goods by establishing their colonies. And their goal was to get as much silver as they could. Another part of this mercantilist thought was that a colonizing country needed to export more than it imported. Spain utilized their empire to produce agricultural products and export them to many different areas around the world and make a lot of money and then build up their foreign trade. Now, before we get too many steps ahead, I want to zoom out and give you a little bit of a bird's eye view of what is happening here because of the collision of the New World, the Americas, which was not new, and the Old World. And when we say that, we're talking about Afro-Eurasia, specifically Europe in this place. But this collision of these two worlds, old and new, brought a floodgate of effects and consequences, known as the Columbian Exchange, named after Columbus. From the bird's eye view, you will see that a massive exchange of goods, specifically plants and animals. Europeans had never experienced food like they had seen in the Americas. Potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, avocados, corn, and beans, they all originated in the Americas. They would bring these delightful foods back to Europe where they could grow because of similar latitudes. Europeans also brought foods to the Americas over time, like coffee and sugar and grapes and bananas and citrus. The real diet-changing part of the exchange would really be animals, as they kind of exchanged European animals and brought them to the Americas. The only domesticated animal in the Americas was the alpaca and the turkey. However, Europeans brought cows and pigs and horses and chickens. The pigs were especially helpful because they bred very quickly and expanded the food supply in the Americas. Horses and oxen helped bring more land under cultivation, plus grains like wheat and rye and oats were brought to the Americas to be farmed and grown. Yet the Columbian Exchange also brought diseases to the Americas, as they had no natural immunities to the old world diseases because they had not been around agriculture and animals for those thousands of years. People in the Americas never really lived closely domesticated animals, and many of the diseases came from contact with animals. Smallpox and measles and malaria and chickenpox, yellow fever were among the deadly diseases that were transferred to the New World, the Americas, the most deadly being smallpox. The smallpox epidemics caused the largest death tolls among Indigenous Americans, killing more people than any war or the Black Death epidemic. The Columbian Exchange will exchange goods, animals, and disease, which will cause massive population loss in the short term. However, over the long term, the exchange will actually increase population, mostly in the old world of Africa, Europe, and Asia, because they brought these crops back with them, which then more food, more people. Europeans also established new cash crop industries in the New World, the Americas. Sugar and tobacco and cotton were successful in the American climates. This will also bring the negative realities of forced labor from the Indigenous Americans at that time. As we are cruising up here at the bird's eye view, let's connect the dots of how disease that devastated the native populations in the Americas will lead to a labor shortage, which then will lead to the unfortunate and terrible beginnings of the Atlantic slave trade, where Africans will be trafficked to the New World to work largely on those agricultural plantations. Now, this is true in both the Spanish Empire but also the Portuguese Empire. As the Portuguese and Spanish were the early leaders in maritime empires, they will reach an agreement known as the Treaty of Tordesillas to clear up the land disputes in the New World. The Spanish did control much of Mesoamerica along with much of South America, with the exception of Brazil, which rested in the Portuguese hands. They will establish a brutal colonial regime based around the sugar industry in Brazil. Now, due to all of this, there are some major gender and family restructuring that has occurred, and this topic usually ends up on the AP test. For example, it disrupted family organizations as families were often separated, and many more men than women were being taken captive. Polygamy, having more than one wife, became more common. Most significantly, we will see how this leads to major demographic changes. The makeup of the population in Latin America looked a lot less native and in many ways a lot more African due to the slave trade. Additionally, we are going to see some major mixing of African, American, European cultures and the people, with all the parties contributing really to this cultural synthesis. The mixing of ethnic groups resulted in new groups of multiracial people, such as mestizos, who were partially native and partially European, or mulattoes, who were partially African and European. This division and hierarchy became quite extensive, as political rights and power based on race really kind of became systemized. That period was a doozy, and this brings us to our next period of time, 1750 to 1900. This is the era of revolutions, the Industrial Revolution, and imperialism. And the biggest of those major shifts in Latin America will be the revolutions that will lead to independence for most in this region. In all of them, many of them are shaped by Enlightenment thought and the ideas of freedom and how the government serves and represents the people, not an absolute ruler or king, especially an absolute ruler that's across the ocean. Now, the first major political revolution in Latin America, which includes the Caribbean, was in Haiti. The Haitian Revolution was similar to the American Revolution in that it was a colony that was trying to break free from their colonial overlords. In this case, it was France. Not Spain. But France was their colonial mother country. Now, let's break down this revolution because it's pretty epic. There were clear tensions between the social classes in Haiti. There were white plantation owners, but there was also this wealthy, free, mixed-race citizens known as mulattoes. There were also petit blancs, or poor whites in Haiti, and a very large enslaved population who were the byproduct of the Atlantic slave trade. Just to give you some numbers, the colonial white population was about 40,000, mulattoes and free blacks was 28,000, and enslaved Africans was about almost 500,000 people. Due to this, there are various voices who wanted freedom or increased rights, and all four of those groups really wanted that. People in Saint-Domingue, the name of the colony at the time, were very much inspired by both the French and the American revolutions. Now, the Haitian Revolution was different, though, from the American Revolution in who was leading the charge. In Haiti's story, it began as a slave revolt and will result in the elimination of slavery there and established the Republic of Haiti. Now, Toussaint Louverture is the guy that you must remember for his leadership. He was enslaved, but later was part of the free black population. He eventually joined the revolt that was started by enslaved Africans and fought for an independent Haiti. Now, this revolution is complex as it is constantly impacted by events that are happening simultaneously in the French Revolution back in Europe. Eventually, Napoleon takes control, and there's this huge fear of him reinstating slavery in Haiti as a major moneymaker for France, was selling sugar and coffee from Haiti. Now, they forced Toussaint to France under duress, but the revolution continued, and eventually in 1804, they broke free of France and became a free republic. Unfortunately, the French require ridiculous indemnity payments for the loss of revenue, and financially independent Haiti was never able to fully thrive once they were free from their colonial chains. Central and South America also had other revolutions known under this umbrella term as the Latin American revolutions that will create independent states there and Spanish and Portuguese colonial rule. The unique part of these revolutions are who led the fight. Creoles led the fight for independence in much of Latin America. Remember, those Creoles were Europeans who were born in the Americas. They never knew of life in Europe. They were definitely white dudes. In South America, a Creole named Simón Bolívar was greatly impacted by the American Revolution and also wanted to create a confederacy of states in South America. In fact, Bolívar's letter from Jamaica isn't just even an illustrative example. It's literally something that you need to be familiar with in the course. It's clearly driven by the Enlightenment thought, which he wrote while he was in Jamaica fleeing from Spanish royalist fighters, where he was unsuccessful in Venezuela from kind of fighting against their rule and finding freedom for Venezuela. He calls for independence, limited government, checks and balance, the whole Enlightenment dream list. Now, while that didn't happen, he helped the states of Venezuela, Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, and Panama all establish independence from the Spanish Empire. He was known as the Liberator, and he's someone that you must know about. Now, Mexico is another very interesting story. They achieved independence from their Spanish colonizers in 1821. But it wasn't all rosy, as many Creoles continued to have more power and native Mexicans were denied rights. It's important to remember that the other revolution that was shaping the world at this time was the industrial one. However, Latin America in its newly independent state did not industrialize like elsewhere did, like the US or Europe, partially because of the political unrest of these movements, along with the wildly socially divided cultures where Creoles, were the ones who were leading the revolutions and gaining power, and they were still very white. Quite frankly, they didn't jump on the industrial bandwagon at this time. What they did focus on was exporting raw materials to these industrialized countries. Silver was still being exported from Mexico, copper from Chile, rubber from the Amazon, beef from Argentine ranches, coffee from Guatemala and Brazil, bananas in Central America, and dare we not forget, bird poop. The academic term for that would be guano, but it was used as fertilizer, and so they became focused on export industries. Now, there's still a lot of foreign investment in Central and South America, which looked different from the imperialism that was occurring in Africa and Asia during this time. However, the economic benefits that were being reaped did not really help the general population in the Americas. In many ways, Latin America became economically dependent on foreign investors, and in some ways, really just indirect imperialism. In fact, there's a term known as banana republics, not to be confused with the store in the mall. A banana republic refers to a small country who is dependent on the export of one crop or good, like bananas. And their economy is largely based on foreign capital or money that is looking to buy that good. So when countries become very interested in a country's good, for their benefit, not for the country's, we find that that's really just imperialism. And in the case of Great Britain, they invested tons of money in Buenos Aires, Argentina. Yes, the city wanted to export their goods, but they really relied on that foreign capital and money to make it happen. Now, all of this is actually linked to another major theme of the era of 1750 to 1900, and that's these major migrations that are happening around the globe. Over 2 million Italians actually migrated to Argentina to work between 1870 and 1960. In fact, their constitution encouraged immigration by Europeans so long as they came to cultivate the soil, improve their industrial businesses, or help teach art and sciences. People came and they helped with those cattle ranches and helped develop Argentina. Now, the effects of these migrations created Italian ethnic enclaves in Argentina. It's why Argentinian food and Italian foods have this unique syncretic blend, all shaped by these migrations and history. And as we shift into the final time period of this course, 1900 to present, we know this era is shaped by the World Wars, the Cold War, and globalization. 7.1 discusses shifting power, and Mexico is a prime example of that. Mexico was under the control of dictator Porfirio Diaz after they achieved independence from the Spanish. 97% of the land was controlled by 1% of the people, and many Mexicans were landless peasants. All of these factors led to the Mexican Revolution of 1910 that lasted through 1920. This revolution was led by Pancho Villa and Zapata, which was successful in 1917 to overthrow the dictator and establish a constitutional republic in Mexico. Now, World War I started in Europe in 1914, and despite it being a world war, you're not going to see a ton of this on your AP test in this region of Latin America. Much of this region was trying to stay neutral during World War I, as their growing national identity was being solidified in these newer nations. Now, the closest connection for sure that you would find is the Zimmermann Telegram. Remember, this was a German proposal to create an alliance with Mexico to help them recover territory they lost to the United States if the United States were to enter the Great War. There was a secret message that the British intercepted, and it did shape the United States joining the war along with the sinking of the Lusitania. Now, once the war was over, though, the global economic crash that occurred impacted those export industries in Latin America. Consumer demand decreased greatly, loans defaulted, a fear of foreign investment, and the prices of goods had huge impacts on pretty much all Latin American countries. World War II only further caused panic, as the region depended on European investment capital, and there was a lot of fighting going on there. Yet another example of foreign investment was the Panama Canal. It started with France, but it was really built by the United States, which connected the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, and it was monumental in the shipping industry. But the 50-mile canal was a key factor during World War II. Strategically, Panama was the most important Latin American nation for the Allies during World War II, because of that link between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans was vital to both commerce and defense. Brazil was the only country to send troops to the European theater of World War II, and Mexico sent a fighter squadron of 300 volunteers to the Pacific. Things actually really got to be heated up during the Cold War, after World War II was over. As the rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union emerged, the ideological debate greatly impacted Latin America. With the economic issues caused by colonization and then indirect imperialism driven by these export-dependent economies, many countries in Latin America wanted stronger government involvement in their economies. Socialism was appealing to some Latin American regimes and populations, which was not okay in the eyes of the United States. So the United States' CIA got just a little busy in this region during this time period. In 1954, the U.S. intervened in Guatemala to overthrow a leftist regime that the United States said was communist. When Fidel Castro led a successful Cuban revolution and Cuba became openly communist and an ally of the Soviet Union, the United States attempted to overthrow Castro covertly, which failed with the Bay of Pigs invasion. It led to the Cuban Missile Crisis and potential nuclear war. The United States and the CIA were just really super busy in Latin America during the Cold War era. There was Chile, where General Augusto Pinochet overthrew the democratically elected but Marxist Salvador Allende in an attempt to save the country from communism. Once in power, Pinochet banned communist parties and had his supporters exiled, tortured, and killed. He was super repressive, but not communist. Then there was Nicaragua. The Sandinistas came to control in 1979 after overthrowing a dictator. However, the Marxist leanings that they had, the United States opposed the new government from the start. U.S. President Ronald Reagan gave his approval for a covert U.S. support of the so-called Contras, anti-Sandinista rebels based in mostly Honduras and Costa Rica, which created unrest in Nicaragua. There are more stories and more CIA involvement, but the Cold War had a huge impact in Latin America and worldwide as the United States and the Soviet Union had this ideological tension that continued. Mexico's economy was improving in the 1930s through the 1970s as they nationalized their oil industry. Nationalized world is always very dangerous during the Cold War era. What nationalization does is it angers foreign investors. But what it does is it allows that the Mexican government to benefit from their oil in their soil and in their ground instead of having foreign investors benefit from it. If you travel to Mexico, or if you live there, say hey in the comments, but you would know that Pemex gas stations are all around and they are the second largest state-owned oil company in the world. And let's give a little more time for Mexico. Mexico and the United States are another example of a more globalized and connected world as we see the creation of NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which is an illustrative example of regional trade agreements. NAFTA took away trade barriers between Mexico, the United States, and Canada. It decreased the cost of consumer goods, made countries involved a significant amount of money. From the U.S. perspective, some manufacturing jobs went to Mexico, specifically in the car industry. However, one of the other effects of NAFTA was the development of jobs in Mexico, which then decreased immigration to the United States as more Mexicans could find jobs locally. Also, globalized culture can be seen as how prominent football, or soccer as we call it in the United States, is throughout Latin America. In fact, the first World Cup was in Uruguay. Latin America continued to dominate. If you look at the FIFA winners throughout history, you're going to see Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina on that list more than once. In fact, Brazil has the most FIFA World Cup titles. With that, I hope that helped you review Latin American history from the beginning of the course all the way to the end. So let's review this whole thing fast from the top. In the 1-minute recap, Aztec and Incas were great civilizations. They were before the Europeans sailed the ocean blue. They used tribute system, agricultural innovations, very large empires. The Spanish conquered both due to their guns, germs, and steel. The Spanish set up the viceroyalty system. The encomienda was the labor system where indigenous people were forced to work on farms. Oppressive, abusive, and de las Casas called it out. Some changes happened with the repartimento system. However, due to the spread of diseases, like the Columbian siege, that brought along devastated populations, there was the rise of the Atlantic slave trade and a whole lot of syncretic beliefs and culture, and a very complicated social hierarchy. Peninsulares, Creoles, mestizos, mulattoes, enslaved individuals, and lots of subclasses. This led to revolutions, but often by the Creoles, not the native populations. Except for Haiti, which started with the slave revolt and ended with a free black republic. Don't forget about Simón Bolivar, he's the liberator. Despite the Industrial Revolution, Latin America was more export dependent. Foreign investment led to indirect imperialism. Less involved in World War I and World War II than other regions, but was super hot during the Cold War. Can't forget about the World Cup, and of course, NAFTA. What's next? Only time will tell. I sure hope that was helpful in connecting the dots and you don't feel so all mixed up and don't know what to do. Feel free to leave me a comment below about anything that you think I missed that you learned about in Latin America. Subscribe to the channel and click the bell to be notified for the rest of the series as it comes out. I hope you learned about yesterday, better understand today, so we can all write a better tomorrow. Keep studying, check out the rest of these videos, you can do this, and good luck as you go on. I'm Steph Gerkes, and we're going to see you next time.